I am Thrisha. I am the Programs and Operations Manager for Hindus for Human Rights, and we're really excited to have you all here today. Desh-Videsh is a series by Hindus for Human Rights that is a transnational discussion platform that brings together voices from India and the diaspora to critically engage in contemporary political and social and cultural issues, framed around the relationship between home, Desh, and abroad, Videsh. The space creates a conversation for nuanced and often difficult conversations on topics such as nationalism, caste, minority rights, and the global circulation of ideologies like Hindutva. Rather than simply informing, it aims to foster discussions and dialogues across contexts and perspectives, foregrounding human rights, pluralism, and critical reflection within and beyond Hindu communities. I'm really excited to have our two guests here today. Anish Gawande is an Indian politician, writer, and advocate who made history as the first openly gay national spokesman for a major political party in India, representing Nationalist Congress Party. Raised in Mumbai, he studied comparative literature at Columbia and public policy at the University of Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar. And prior to entering party politics, he bridged grassroots activism and governance by founding Pink List India, the country's first digital archive tracking political accountability and legislative support for LGBTQ rights. Um, so welcome, Anish. And Janani Ramachandran is an American politician representing District 4 on the Oakland City Council. Born and raised in the East Bay of South Asian Indian descent, she graduated from Stanford and Berkeley School of Law and worked in human rights law, community health prior to public office. Upon winning her council seat in 2022, Ramachandran made history as the youngest person ever elected to the Oakland City Council, its first South Asian member and first openly gay um, LGBTQ woman of color to serve on the city council. So welcome both of you. I'm really excited to have this conversation. Um,
So much for having
so
us.
Thank you.
yeah, so I want to start kind of to talk about like where we are currently and maybe we can start with Anish and you can ground us. So in March 2026, the Transgender Persons Amendment Bill was passed in both houses and signed into law, replacing the 2019 framework with a law that limits legal recognition to historically accepted groups like Hydra and Kinner, mandating medical certificates and removing recognition for those who self-identify as trans or not gender non-binary. And this
You know,
comes on top of the Supreme Court legislation that dismisses marriage equality review petitions. So are we looking at a two-front regression, legislative and judicial, within the spaces of roughly a year? Um, how would you characterize the state of queer and trans rights in India today?
I think we have to understand those two questions slightly separately, right? And I think primarily, if you ask me, in 2018, after we sort of finally decriminalized homosexuality and queerness by the reading down of Section 377, um, until 2008, we did not think that we would even get to decriminalization, right? So I think 2018 was a landmark watershed moment made possible by a whole host of sort of social, political, and sociocultural factors, right? So I think after 2018, I think we were excited, we were exuberant, we were optimistic. We mounted in 5 years possibly the quickest challenge for marriage equality post decriminalization in any former colony, right? I think it was a very, very swift move to have a five-judge constitution bench consider the marriage equality question. I think that was a victory in and of itself. The fact that we fought hard and we lost is still a major moment that I don't think signifies regression. in many ways, right? I think it's par for the course. We know this is what it means to do strategic litigation. You win some, you lose some, you win some again, right? We've been through this path with 377 before. When it comes to trans rights, however, you've seen a definitive regression, right? So when the Trans Act Amendment Bill was passed, there were a couple of us, activists across sort of LGBTQIA plus identities, sitting together. And we've just been discussing how India has been more progressive on trans rights than it has been on other sort of issues of gender and sexuality, right? Or that it's been far ahead of other countries in terms of trans rights. I would argue that the Trans Act, even with its amendments, still provides more protections to trans persons than most legislations across the United States of America, which are anti-trans by law rather than by omission, right? So let us be very clear that in India today, you have sort of transphobia by omission. We have not reached a stage of transphobia by commission or by sort of anti-trans lawmaking that directly sort of targets trans people. But at the same time, this omission has become part of a larger project that is imported transphobia that is coming. And we know this now, that these legislations that are being brought forth against trans rights, these sort of amendments that are being brought forth against trans rights are coming from abroad, right? This is foreign money being pumped into India to support anti-trans legislation through conservative organizations, primarily based in the United States of America. This is what they've done in Uganda. This is what they're currently doing in Senegal. This is what they've done in Ghana. So this is a sort of almost neo-colonial import. This new transphobia seems to be something that we're importing unasked for from the United States. And that's something we've been discussing how to combat. I don't think we currently really know the sources of such funding. We don't know what their links are to politics, to government, to other sort of institutions in the United States. But this is incredibly concerning from a sort of regression on trans rights perspectives, which, as we all know, will always eventually result in a sort of persecution of queer voices across the board. They come for trans folks first, they will come for gay people next. It's silly to believe that gay men or sort of LGBT communities can ditch the T to sort of prevent the transphobia from reaching them. I think we've seen the impact of transphobia abroad. We need to stem the sort of growth of transphobia in India because it is a relatively newer phenomenon in its current avatar that we know little of. Sorry, I rambled.
No, that was really comprehensive. Thank you. And on the other side, Janani, California has positioned itself as a sanctuary for LGBTQ communities and particularly trans people with some of the strongest state level protections. But over the last few years, as the return of the Trump administration, we've seen renewed federal efforts to restrict gender recognition, limit access to gender affirming care, roll back diversity and inclusion initiatives, and elevate anti-trans rhetoric in national politics. So, against this backdrop, how would you categorize the state of queer and trans rights in the
Oh,
Trisha, you're frozen.
yeah.
Oops.
Can you guys hear me now?
Yeah,
Yes.
you're back.
Oh, so sorry. Yeah, so towards the end of that question, how would you characterize the state of queer and trans rights in the US today, and how are they translating into real belonging for queer communities on the ground?
Absolutely. I think what Anish was talking about the ebbs and flows of how rights have progressed and then backtrack is similar. I'm so proud to be from California and to be a state that has enshrined many of these protections in our state constitution, as well as a city, Oakland, which has historically been, a beacon of hope for LGBT communities, especially LGBTQ communities of color. But the reality is, less than a year and a half ago, 6 million Californians voted for Trump. In 2008 is not that long ago. And that was when Prop 8 was passed, which repealed our marriage protections here in California. Fast forward to when Trump got elected again a year and a half ago, we enshrined Prop 3 in our Constitution, which, reaffirms marriage equality. But even in a place like California, there's this ebb and flow. So we have our local protections, at various cities have specific LGBTQ related protections. This is the city of Oakland. The state has it as far as legal protections, non-discrimination, limiting cooperation with out-of-state agencies that are specifically anti-trans or trying to deny gender-affirming care. But the kind of the popular rhetoric of a lot of everyday people, regardless of whether or not you voted for Trump, regardless if you're a Democrat, Republican, or no party, it's this enabling of these anti-LGBTQ attitudes societally that you definitely see coming out more all over the state, even in places as lefty as Oakland. And I feel like kind of this toxic rhetoric from the top is really bringing the worst out of people, or maybe people kept quiet about their true beliefs, but especially anti-trans rhetoric is getting worse and worse for sure in this political environment, and not specifically attributed to Trump, but it's this. Well, we can talk freely now. We don't care about being woke anymore. Me Too is over. There's this. We're rolling back, and we should be able to speak our mind. And there's a freedom in not having to police your language of being politically correct all the time. But when that language gets to hate speech, then we're again regressing culturally, and that's something that I definitely see. Now, I think it's an incredibly toxic statement that the Trump administration made, that you had two of the very first executive orders in January 2025, very soon after Trump gets into office, saying, we only recognize male and female sexes. Like, that was one of the first things of all of the things the president could have tackled that he did. And I have many trans friends who there's a lot of different bodies of law that the federal stuff trumps locally, like your passport, the ability to have X on your identity documents. It was a very scary time for trans folks, especially all over the country. And then that leads to another executive order on restricting gender affirming care for minors, and then people going after various entities that are providing gender affirming care. And kind of going back to that, how the federal stuff impacts the local context, even in a place like the city of Oakland, which, we've proudly supported LGBTQ rights, and everyone goes to the pride parades and everyone calls themselves allies. Yet all of a sudden we have local groups in Oakland challenging the fact that our city employees get as part of our healthcare plans, gender affirming care is included. And they're like, should taxpayer dollars go towards these kinds of things? And, sometimes when I've heard these comments from people I know and represent as a local council member, it just shows the kind of ugly underbelly of what the stuff at the top is enabling at this level. So I think that it's frightening. There's an ebb and flow, and I hope that we start trending back on the way up with new elections, hopefully in the midterms later this year.
Yeah, and we're really looking to see how the midterms affect and have taken advantage of what Trump has brought. Um so both of you sit at this particular intersection, both South Asian and queer, working within institutions that were not necessarily built for you and therefore don't fully recognize you. So what's it like, and what may it actually cost, both politically and personally, to work within those structures? And we can start with whoever would like to take that first.
I can go for it. I actually, Janani, thank you for that. I think you encapsulated so much of the anxiety that's currently underway, even in India, because this kind of ebb and flow seems to be par for the course for what's happening around the world and has happened for decades. But I think that we haven't managed to create enough institutions to create enough support networks, to create enough sort of safe spaces to be able to deal with this kind of pushback should it emerge in a major way right now. And I think that's where we've learned so much from the work being done by folks like you in California, but also done by folks in Poland who got rid of no gay zones, by folks in sort of, I mean, even Hungary right now, who were part of the team that was pushing for the sort of government that comes after Orban to be more accepting of LGBTQ plus rights, right? I think we're in a stage where we're in a moment of precarity. And I think in that precarity, LGBTQ plus rights are very much at risk in a country like India. I say this all because I think it makes the question of what does it mean to be out in politics much trickier. For the longest time, I never thought I could come out because I thought it would be politically impossible for me to be out and in politics in India. It was only when I came back to India for the 2019 national elections, worked in an election campaign, traveled across the state, started Pinkless, sort of got an idea that the conversation was not where we thought it was, that actually politicians in rural India were more likely to support LGBTQ plus rights than politicians in urban India. It wasn't the same sort of difference that you see in the West, where older politicians are anti-LGBTQ plus issues, younger politicians are pro-LGBTQ plus issues. Actually, in India, you had a whole lot of really old politicians being very supportive of LGBTQ plus rights. My party leader, Sharad Pawar, was supportive, but so was H.D. Deve Gowda, the former prime minister, when Section 377 was read down. He's 94 now. He must have been 84 then. Arguably one of the oldest politicians in the country, but also one of the most progressive on LGBTQ plus rights, right? So when I realized that that tension didn't exist nearly in the same way that I thought it did, it became possible for me to sort of enter party politics, get appointed to my position, become the first gay man to do so. But as that pendulum swings back now, I think there's concern. I mean, you don't know when your queerness can and will be used against you, whether that's through sort of petty campaigns that are primarily trolling led, especially if you're contesting, but also those that are sort of more whisper networky led, where you see that homophobia and transphobia play out in different ways. I think the question is if that pendulum swings, being gay, which was not such a big problem until now, becomes a very big problem, both for me personally, but for queer people across the country. And I think in that political moment, I don't know if political parties will be able to take the kind of risk in some ways that they did with me, appointing an openly gay man, despite knowing that there would be pushback, if they sense that the public mood is not with them. And I think that's what we've seen happen with trans rights. I think the government realized that the mood on trans rights was shifting, so they didn't need to sort of work for trans rights anymore. If the government senses that the mood on gay rights is shifting, they don't need to act on gay rights anymore, or rather, they need to push back against gay rights, then I think we're in trouble.
Yeah, I'll piggyback on that, this concept that Anish, you mentioned of the pendulum swinging back and forth, and you don't know when and where your identity can be weaponized against you based on the political climate is very real. So I identify as bisexual. In my first campaign that I ran in, I was with a woman, and by the time I had my second campaign, I was with a man who I'm now with and have a child with. And so even in a place that I say is as left as Oakland, because we at one point of history had the highest population of queer women living together in the entirety of California, I believe, potentially the entire country, the highest population of queer women, which is great. But so not translated to the petty politics of, oh, she's not if she's with a woman, she can't be a family person. And I'm like, this is Oakland. Why are like how is that relevant to city council or state assembly, which is what I first ran for, and then oh, she's with a man now, so then it's by erasure. Then it's oh, okay, well, she's not really queer. We can take that part of the identity out, despite me mentioning that as part of my identity darn near everywhere I go. Um, I think there's this idea that it's people that I think there's these misconceptions in this in a lot of like left cities that oh people use their queer identity to show that they're cool or to show to whatever, and I'm like no, I struggled with that identity. I still do. This is not any kind of brownie points to be like oh let me just throw a flag next to my name on things, and like there's stories behind this, there's difficulties behind this, but that being said, I will say that I feel, for the most part, minus kind of the pettiness and politics and strategic weaponization of my identity at certain times, for the most part, I feel grateful that we have an LGBT set of communities in Oakland that is intersectional, that you don't have a lot of you in a lot of major cities in America, you have a strong gay community, but usually specifically white gay men. You know, their
Yeah.
pride festivals are full of that. There's this privilege with that. And there's relatively fewer cities where it is easy and acceptable to be a brown or black person and have that and celebrate that same level of freedom. And I think that that's certainly what drove me to Oakland specifically when I was younger, of wanting to be like this. Once I knew I was queer when I was young, I'm like, well, Oakland is where I want to be in the Bay Area. This is where I feel the most at home and the most myself. And I think that's the way for that's certainly the case for a lot of people. So despite kind of the politics side of it, I think societally, I wouldn't rather be doing this anywhere else, at least at this point of my career. An interesting story, though, is when I first ran for office, I was not out to, in 2021, I was not out to most family at all, or most people. I think a small circle of like family members knew, my friends and social circles definitely knew, but um, I came out through the media talking about, oh, the LGBTQ woman of color runs for office, and then it made its way to some Indian newspapers in a few different languages. I remember my grandfather, my late grandfather, being so excited and, clipping out a Tamil language newspaper with my photo and a sari on inauguration day. And it's talking about my queer identity. And I'm like, oh my gosh, what's going on? All of a sudden, I'm out to how many ever levels of people reading these ethnic print media outlets, which I know is quite a lot. And so that's kind of how I came out to my broader family in India. And to be fair, no one made too much of a big deal out of it. I think because it was a set of, this is exciting that you're doing politics. And it just never talked about. To this day, I've not talked, apart from noticing things in the media with my broader family. I've never spoken about my queer identity minus kind of my immediate like family and parents and stuff. So, but it exists and they know it and they're like, well, there's more exciting things, I guess, that we can talk about. But that's how I came out through the news.
I just want to quickly jump in here, Janani, and say that is so relatable because I had a similar experience when I launched Pinkless, when there was an interview in the Times of India that had a very big photo of mine in it. And it was next to Shobha Day's column, which is the only reason anybody ever saw it. And it came out in the Sunday Times of India. And I remember waking up one day, and I don't wake up very early, which is a very big problem. I woke up one day with like hundreds of calls because until then I wasn't very publicly out. And then suddenly they were like, the headline says you're always told you can't be queer and in politics, that needs to change. And they were like, is that news? And it was amazing because in some ways it takes the pressure off. But you're right, it's just never come up again. And I don't know how you deal with this because I think I struggle sometimes. As somebody who's also a gay man, right? Who's apparently straight passing, although I can't see how. When people A, assume I'm straight, or B, there's often people who've very honestly come up to me and said, with good intention, that we love that you're gay, but don't make it your whole identity. And I'm like, thank you for your support. And I don't know how to process that, but and I think I don't know, right? Like sometimes you're more palatable politically, or you aspire to be more palatable politically. And sometimes it just happens that politics sort of transforms some of that.
Absolutely. No, I think that's fascinating. We have that in common about, well, we've talked about this once and not again. And I think that that opening also helped me be able to feel okay with broader communities, not just, extended relatives in India, but even now when I go into communities in locally when I'm with Black elders or Latino elders or others, where I often have this fear of, well, like I'm not going to talk about me being queer or whatnot if we're having a conversation. But I'm like, you know what? If people in my own home country can be on board and be supportive, and even if they're not proud of me being out, they're proud of being proud of me. It's almost been this thing that I feel more emboldened to continue to pursue that um, openness here with different communities as well. So, and I hope that continues to grow. And I think what I see locally here is younger generations, Gen Z, South Asians are definitely breaking the mold in different ways as well and coming out and being more open about it in ways that, I had this fear and trepidation until I was 29 on the news saying it. But I'm proud that a lot more broader South Asian families and communities here are being more receptive to it.
Yeah. Thank you both for, I mean, what is it? Very clearly a very unique experience of having to come out at a very public level before you maybe have really come to terms with what that means for you both personally and professionally. Um, but I want to switch gears a little bit to some of
Trisha, your voice is cutting
the
again.
more questions. And so, Anish, I'm wondering, um, one of the central questions facing many marginalized communities today is not just whether they possess formal rights, but whether they're able to belong fully and within dominant visions of Hindu identity. How do you understand the relationship between queer politics and Hindu majoritarianism in contemporary India? And what does that mean to advocate for LGBTQ rights in a political environment where questions of citizenship and minority rights are being contested?
I think you need to understand Hindutva as a political project that reimagines what it means to be an Indian citizen. It takes us away from the democratic, socialist, secular fabric that we'd imagined of in 1947, and then again in 1950 when we gave unto ourselves the constitution that we did. And so once you understand the project of Hindutva as a project of world making, that is essentially against the solidarities we struggled so hard to build, which is essentially against the diversity we fought so hard to protect, that's essentially against the unity that we have sort of struggled to uphold, then you understand the resistance to that majoritarianism is to pursue exactly those solidarities. So the only solution right now in the face of this direct assault on citizenship in India is a reaffirmation of commitment between communities, right? So we saw that in the CA NRC protests, queer, trans, and sort of Bahujan communities led marches together on Savitribai Phule's birth anniversary, right? So you had Dalit, Muslim, queer solidarity being built for the first time. You saw that during the environmental activist protests where queer issues were brought up with environmental issues. I remember we raised a slogan when Bolsonaro was in Delhi for our Republic Day parade, which said, Are Bolsonaro queer ladai, Are Amazon queer ladai, Modi Bolsonaro bhai bhai. Right. So, suddenly environmental groups and sort of queer groups came together. So queerness has to find alliances and solidarities to be able to be a part of a new sort of citizenship imagination, which is, I think, what I've been inspired by you, Janani, the work that you've done with AAPI communities, right? That I remember even when I was in the US, Indians didn't really think that they could go to the sort of AAPI events. And it was this strange sort of situation where you didn't want to, or rather didn't know how to fit into this larger imagination that was taking place within the US. And I think those solidarities are very important to forge. The solidarities with faith groups are very important to forge. And those are as important in India today as they are anywhere in the world in the face of that majoritarianism.
Yeah, absolutely. And Janani, on the other side, um, we keep hearing that policies are often justified through appeals to what the majority wants. But the polling is telling us a different story, that queer communities in particular have watched legal recognition come and then be clawed back between trans healthcare bans and bathroom bills. And how do you think about that gap between who's pushing the agenda and the majoritarian rhetoric used to legitimize them? And what does that mean for democratic belonging, where rights are contingent on who's in power?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, everything, all the pushback we've been seeing in this administration, I think, like I said before, it unlocks the worst in people. So so once the whole concept, January 2025, Trump comes in and says there's only men and only women, and we can't have trans athletes in women's sports. That all of a sudden becomes this hot button issue when it's realistically a very small number of people that are trans women competing in women's sports. And it hits the Bay Area very starkly. There is a case in San Jose where a fellow student athlete on a team sues, engages in a series of lawsuits to attack one of, her counterparts on the team who's trans, who's like, we just want to play sports. How did this become this major national political fight? And Trump zooms in on this Bay Area case. And then all of a sudden, you have people who are like, yeah, we're allies. We love LGBTQ people, all of that, being like, you know what? Maybe they shouldn't play in sports. Maybe they shouldn't, um, maybe that is not fair. But it becomes this big distraction. I mean, every other day, national discourse from the White House is talking about trans athletes and women's sports like there's nothing else on their agenda to do. Like it becomes this focal point because, well, of all of the anti-trans things they're talking about, maybe this strikes a chord in a small number of people. Um, and then you simultaneously have the vice president and others going off about, well, everyone should have the right to play sports. All girls should be able to go play sports except for trans athletes. And, sorry, I'm kind of going all over the place with this, but it's just been this thing that's become a focal point when it's like, when did we start talking about who can play sports and who cannot play sports? Like this has been such a big distraction that unfortunately strikes a chord with folks who otherwise would not identify as conservative. And I think it's an example of how it's troubling and unlocking the worst in people. And then we have the stuff that's not talked about as much. It's often, I remember when the first year I started college, 2010, we had a big campus dialogue about whether trans people should serve in ROTC, which is like precursor to the military. And at the time, I met my dorm RA was the first ever openly trans person that I got to engage with, and we'd have these conversations, and he's he's a Filipina trans man, and like was openly talking about whether his identity in ways that were really quite horribly attacked. And now I'm like, it's 2026 and we're having the same exact conversations about whether you have the right to participate in the military. But the harsher side of that is the same men versus women ban extends to federal prisons, where you have to be assigned to the prison based on your sex at birth, which is horrible. Which is again because it's federal prisons, even state laws can't override. So I feel like we're fixated on some of these. A lot of dialogue is fixated on things that are not always that really capture people's imaginations and interests. Like this is the number one issue in the country right now, having trans women serve on women's sports teams, versus kind of the really sick underbelly of what's going on and the attacks on trans people really continuing. And I think, you know, at the end of the day, we had over 70 million people in America vote for Trump, but that is still not a majority of the country. And I know that, I mean, maybe I think too good of people's deepest selves, but I think that we can, this does not, the policies enacted in no ways reflect the majority of what the average person here thinks. And I want to believe that the pendulum will swing backwards and we can reaffirm our commitment to LGBTQ rights, but also particularly the intersections. Because at the end of the day, it's Pride Month here right now, and Pride started off as a riot by Black trans women. And it is so lost from the memory of people, that intersectionality of how much that is now it's marketed as, corporate pride and let's hang a flag and, sell merch and show that we're queer friendly without remembering, the very revolutionary origins of pride, the realities of how hard of police brutality at the time against specifically Black trans women, and these intersections that are often lost that, it's that intersectionality is definitely not as strong even within LGBTQ movements across the country that I think it could be.
Yeah, thanks, Janani. And I always laugh, especially when there's so much information about trans athletes in women's sports, because I'm like, this is the most any of y'all have ever cared about women's sports. No one ever cares about women's sports until there is a controversy about whether someone should be allowed, and that's not something that they're willing to have the conversation about either. Um but yeah, I want to move on to kind of questions about like competing visions of belonging. And so, Anish, much of the public conversations around queerness in India have become important conversations about history. Was queerness always here? Was homophobia imported? Are there queer traditions within Hinduism? And you've spent a lot of years engaging with these questions. What do you think is gained and what's lost when queer politics kind of becomes a debate about the past?
This is something that I've spent a lot of time on. I think to give you brief context, right? I think many of us, including me, were part of several protests against Section 377, which was criminalizing carnal intercourse against the order of nature, which was a Victorian era law that was still on the statute books until 2009, when the Delhi High Court sort of read it down, and then was back on the statute books in 2013, when the Supreme Court, in a historic verdict, decided that queer people were a minuscule minority and therefore did not deserve special protections, and put Section 377 back on the statute books, right? So that entire fight against Section 377, which started in 2013, which is when I was in school at the age of 17, was a fight built around the idea that Section 377 was a British import and that India had been progressive before the arrival of the British, right? This was a very convenient sort of telling of history. It allowed us to say that striking down 377 would be queer azadi, queer freedom. In fact, when Section 377 was actually read down by a sort of constitution bench in 2018, it was celebrated as queer azadi, right? Or as queer Independence Day, you know? And that does a fundamental disservice to our ability to ally with other movements, right? Because what do you say when you're saying that India was progressive before the British arrived? You say that queer women don't matter, because women did not have the choice of who they wanted their partner to be, let alone whether their partner should be another man, another woman, or a person of any other gender, right? So you're clearly excluding women because we have absolute proof that practices like sati were still prevalent even before the British, right? And so this historical revisionism that assumes that everything before the British was perfect does a disservice to progressive movements like the Bhakti poets, right? Who fought so hard to sort of reform religion and society and eradicate some of these evils. So clearly we had evils even before the British. Similarly, it erases any links to caste. You assume that before the British, caste was not relevant. This is a sort of myopic, liberal view that is not rooted in progressive politics that acknowledges differences across caste, class, religion, and gender, right? Because then you're assuming that sort of caste hierarchies did not exist and that queer people were somehow devoid of caste before the British arrived in India. But the final and the most dangerous sort of aspect of saying that the British brought homophobia to India is that there is now an argument being made that it is the British and the Muslims who brought homophobia to India, right? There is a sustained Islamophobic campaign currently underway in India that seeks to convince queer people that they should not have any solidarities with Muslims and, in fact, should be actively Islamophobic because Muslims are against queer rights. Muslims will take rights away from queer people. When the reality is that Muslim leaders like Asaduddin Owaisi have been more progressive on LGBTQ plus rights than the BJP. And I mean, this is surreal, right? The head of a party that is an Islamic party is more progressive than the head of the party, which claims to be a sort of Hindu nationalist party. So the argument that Hindu nationalism tries to make when it says that queerness was accepted before the British and before Islam falls flat because the same Muslims they decry are the Muslims supporting LGBTQ plus rights. When the marriage equality, when the Trans Act Amendment Bill is introduced in Parliament, it's the Indian Union Muslim League, another sort of party based out of Kerala, whose MPs stand up and oppose it. So we have this situation where we don't want to sort of stick to this narrative that queerness was only sort of penalized by colonialism. And that's where the sort of conventional historiography takes us, because that's the convenient argument to make. But you also have to recognize that it carries with it an emotional thrust that is very difficult to unwork once those strands have been laid in place, right? So I think in some ways we might have to dismantle this original rewriting of history and replace it with a more authentic rewriting of history that celebrates the fact that Baba Sahib Ambedkar was the first man to stand up for a magazine publishing articles on homosexuality, that Namdev Dhasal, the head of the Dalit Panthers, was the first person to march with trans sex workers from Kamatipura, Mumbai's red light district, to the house of Sharad Pawar, who was then the chief minister, who now happens to be my boss, to demand protection from money lenders, right? So you had an intersection of queer and class issues, you had an intersection of queer and Dalit issues, and in the late 90s, the ABVA, which sort of the AIDS Bhedbhav Virodhi Andolan, which released the first sort of fight against Section 377 before NAS Foundation in Delhi took it out. The ABVA released a manifesto that reads like a very progressive sort of manifesto even today, right? It had cross-sectional concerns. It positioned queerness as a progressive force. And I think if we rewrite history to saying that queerness has always fought back against any kind of discrimination, whether that be under pre-colonial India, whether that be under sort of colonial India, whether that be today, I think that's the historiography we need to move towards. Pop history can often take us in very dangerous directions.
Yeah, that's really helpful to understand. And for Janani, with many South Asian diaspora communities, queerness is often framed as a tension between tradition and modernity, or cultural preservation and assimilation. But those narratives can obscure the fact that tradition and culture are constantly contested and changing. So, how have you seen queer South Asians in the diaspora challenge those binaries? And what do you think mainstream conversations about culture and belonging still get wrong?
Absolutely. Well, everything Anish was saying made me realize I gotta spend some more time in India talking to
Come,
queer.
come, come, come.
Because I'm like, a lot of folks back here are still trapped in this revisionist history mindset that, nah, before the British came, life was good for the queers, the women, all of that. And, look at our temple inscriptions. You have women having sex and life was good. So, everything you're talking about related to that, related to foreign money infiltrating the anti-trans movement. And I'm like, of course, like that makes so much sense. Like, I have so much to learn. And it's interesting. I was born here and I lived in the States till I was 12. And then I went to high school in Bangalore. I moved to India in kind of these teenage years. And I remember, and then I came back for college and stayed since. But my perception of cultural norms and traditions when I was growing up in the Bay Area with the predominantly Indian American immigrant community was so different. Like I definitely got a culture shock when I moved to Bangalore. And that was it's not representative of all of India, of course, but it was, the tech boom was happening. There was, a lot of gentrification, a lot of people coming in. It was a very interesting time to live there. But I just remember the more conservative ideas of society and community that I grew up with in the Bay Area as a child were challenged when I moved to India. And I'm like, oh, and this is not these people are just being Western. This is India is actually, there's a lot of communities in India that are actually a lot more open-minded than what you see in America. And I think you see that with the support in America for Hindutva movements coming from, especially less so, I think, working class Indian American communities in America, but definitely the wealthier Indian American communities all over the country, are showing money, support, funding politicians, aligning with Zionists. A lot of these troubling behaviors that you see here coming from wealth. And I always think about my own experiences of, nah, things were not so rich, culturally rigid in the way that I think I grew up believing that it might be in India. And so I grew up singing Carnatic music. I was trained in it since I was 5. I still sing it to this day. It's been a very important part of my identity. And I think my connection to the arts and to an ancient art form, the good and the bad, the songs that are traditional and gender bending and talk about love and relationships and complicated feelings, and also those that it's like you have it all. You have those that make me really proud to be from this beautiful culture, and then others that you talk that engage with the caste system, that talk about problematic themes, that engage support the patriarchy. I think my background in having and thinking about the arts and classical arts in India has given me the understanding of, yes, you have it all. There's parts of this beautiful culture and religion that are liberating, that are, queer and modern and all of these ideas. And there's also that are incredibly problematic. And, you take what you want from it, but there's no one fixed identity of, if you grow up learning Bharatanatyam and singing Carnatic music, therefore you are a traditional Indian person. There's so many different interpretations of the classical arts, and which is one of the things that has definitely rooted me to what I see as a complicated set of all arts and culture. It's like, yes, the British banned Bharatanatyam dancers or different kinds of dancers from being in temples, and many of them had to turn to prostitution and other things. But that doesn't mean life was good for dancers before that to start with, even if they were not specifically engaged in the sex trade. So I think I think I just have to spend more time in India and bask in the complexities and think more about and understand more of this revisionist history for sure. So I have a lot of learning to do, but um, and thinking of intersectionality as well, there's so much that, I owe to the civil rights movement, to Black leadership, and in particular being able to be an out, open South Asian politician. But Oakland is home of the Black Panthers, and Huey Newton very famously back in the early 70s talked about how LGBTQ people are the most oppressed in the world, especially the intersection of Black and LGBTQ. And the Gay Liberation Front did a lot. Like the FBI was really freaking scared of the combination of the Black Panthers and the Gay Liberation Front, because these are two radical groups that are actively thinking about intersectionality at a time where most people weren't. And they're like, we're gonna stand up for you. We're gonna stand up for you. The Gay Liberation Front was out there trying to help the Free Bobby Seale movement. They were actively talking about other intersectional issues, talking about freedom for Palestine and all these things back then that show how powerful but dangerous in the eyes of the government intersectional movements really could be. And there's nothing, sometimes you think of movements in isolation of, all right, the Black Panthers fought for Black people. No, they fought for a lot of other people as well. And I certainly owe a lot of my rights and privileges to them and many other groups that really paved the way in California and beyond for people of color.
Yeah, thanks, Janani. So to kind of build on what you're talking about in terms of what you guys are learning from one another, one of the goals of the Desh-Videsh series is to create genuine dialogue across experiences and perspectives. So I would love to invite each of you to pose maybe a question to one another, something you're curious about, something you think your own context struggles with, or maybe a point of tension that you'd like to explore further. Maybe I'll hand it over to Anish first.
Sure, and I really enjoy this format. I get to ask Janani a question, which I'm very excited about. And you think you have to learn a lot of India from India and in India, but rather we have to learn a lot about what's happening in the US. Because I think what's remarkable, right, which you also alluded to, is that I was very surprised when I moved to New York in 2014 as to how conservative Indian Americans were. I said, "Have you been to India recently? Like this idea of India is a little off." Like when I go to Bangalore, I turn my back to the crowd and suddenly everyone's making out. I don't know what you think India is, right? Like at Kitty Sue, people are letting loose, and that is also perfectly all right. And that is an India finding its own voice and a new language of desire, right? Beyond the sort of shackles that we were placed in. But what I'm really interested in knowing, Janani, from you is how do you manage to convince the most conservative within the Indian American community, whether it was in LGBTQ plus rights, or whether it was honestly on the broader project of protecting democracy or not voting a certain way in the last election? Because we know that Indian Americans did vote for Trump, right? How do you, or a very simple question, how would you convince an Indian American who wants to vote for Trump that it's actually against their own interests?
Absolutely. So, I mean, I want to start off with the Indian American community is obviously not a monolith. So there's a part of my identity that's a very different world. So my maternal grandparents moved from India in the early 70s to New York City. And there was a wave, less so in California at the time, more on the East Coast, as well as you get different migration patterns into the US from India. And this was a time where immigration was real easy and you did not, it was relatively easy to actually be able to migrate from a legal perspective. And so my grandparents didn't have any degrees, no certification. They just came as, at the time, they were typists. They had their typing background and stenography background, and they came to seek work and have a better job for their kids and their little family. And you have a lot of very working class folks that were part of a lot of strong Indian American communities in places like New York City and other parts of the country that to this day, my grandparents who are still alive in New York, they will always vote Democrat. They were part of labor unions. They were kind of like, it's intrinsic that we are going to support other working class people. They may not shout from the rooftops, we love LGBTQ people, but it's economic equality is very present, the concept of it among working class South Asians, in my perspective, that moved here and are like, our fight is your fight too. More recently, we see this immense wealth and concentration of wealth among a lot of Indian American communities. And also, with immigration rules getting more stricter, you have more privileged folks from India being able to immigrate here with higher degrees, often caste privilege, all these other things, that we have this concentration of wealth and this. I don't know, definitely those Hindutva beliefs being more strong. It's like my grandparents in New York couldn't care less for Modi and or any of that stuff. They're just like, hey, we were on survival mode in this country for most of our life, and we just want, basic rights for everyone. And, you know, it's a different mindset that, well, now we have money and time and the privilege to care about what's happening in our home country, and those views are definitely more conservative. Um, and when one thing you mentioned about that intersection between anti-Islamophobia, I think that's what's becoming more strong as well among various categories of Indian American immigrants here. And things like the Trump administration, Islamophobia has way predated the Trump administration. You really saw that post 9/11 stronger and stronger when we had kind of this joint hatred of where society, really took a stand for um, bending towards more Islamophobic views being spewed by all political parties. And that was definitely that's definitely troubling. But going back to your question about um, I guess convincing kind of these conservative Indian Americans. I mean, a huge part of um, campaigning is fundraising. So I'm like, I want to raise money from people who may not necessarily agree with even my queer identity and my queer viewpoints or necessarily what I stand for, but how can I find that common ground? So and I'll give an example. My first campaign, one of the central parts of my platform when I ran for state office was raising the minimum wage to $22 an hour, which is really not that it's not a living wage. It's not that high from compared to 15 what it was before. But at that time in 2021, it was, oh, how dare you? Do you want small businesses to go out of existence? What an awful concept. And I got the most pushback for the raising the minimum wage conversation from Indian Americans, from wealthier Indian Americans who I was going to ask to for campaign contributions. And they're like, how do we reconcile with you seeming to be against small businesses and Indian American business owners by raising a minimum wage? And it was a series of tough conversations, and I often that you can also always often find common ground, but it's the kind of thing that wouldn't be a conversation with working class Indian Americans who migrated at different periods of time in different parts of the country. So I almost feel like this conservativeness and economic and fiscal conservativeness is newer among a lot of the communities here. And I mentioned, patterns of migration from, working class folks on the East Coast. Even before that, in California, you had farmers that were some of the earliest migrants to California in the Central Valley who came with a completely different economic mindset, too. And again, that's just not the the most vocal set of Indian Americans out here today. Unfortunately, we see more and more not just being conservative, but like actively Republican. We have the Usha Vances and all of these uh, toxic people who are rising to positions of power because it's this new sexy thing to be a conservative South Asian person in politics. And it's frightening. And I'm like, this is so not reflective of so many, generations of migrants from India and from South Asia to the States, but they're some of the most loudest, powerful voices. And I think that is problematic. So I'm glad for local movements, at least, locally in places like Oakland. Now we see it in LA as well. You see more progressive, very unapologetic left-leaning politicians who are like, yes, I'm South Asian, I'm not conservative, I care about intersectionality, we need to stand up for Black folks, we need to stand up for trans folks. Economic equality, is a common denominator, and I'm glad that we are starting to see more unapologetically progressive South Asians in public life and in political life, and I hope that's the trend we geared most towards. Sorry, I was all over the place, but I'm like, your question just made me think about a whole bunch of other things about putting Indian Americans in a box because those are the ones that are sending the most money to Hindutva moments, and the ones who are saying the craziest things are, represent a subsect, but they are the ones with power. And I hope that power dynamic shifts back.
Also,
Um,
very important to note Sujata Gidla's work. I think that opened my eyes a lot, Ants Amongst Elephants, to the idea that queer, sort of South Asian diasporas, rather not queer diasporas, were very diverse. And the kinds that we associate with sort of Silicon Valley CEOs are not the only South Asian diasporas in the US.
yeah, absolutely. And Janani, do you have a question for Anish?
I have so many questions, but I'll start with, um, what would you want folks in Indian Americans out here to know about, what we can do to combat the, I mean, I'm so struck by what you were talking about, the revisionist history, that no, life wasn't good for everyone before the British came. And, what are things you wish folks knew about the queer movement in India today and how we have to grapple with the truth about history in the Indian subcontinent when it comes to queer rights and intersectionality of queer rights.
I mean, that's a difficult question. I think the only answer to that question is by sort of being in tune with a lot of non-mainstream queer groups in India, right? I think there are Ambedkarite queer groups in India. There are sort of the Queer Muslim Project and other groups that are based on faith lines. There are sort of also sort of some groups that are based on broader sort of Marxist politics, right? Very left-wing politics. So there are a lot of ways to sort of get queer critique from India of the state of queerness in India that Instagram makes very possible. So I think Dalit Queer Project is something to follow, um, uh, the sort of Queer Muslim Project is something to follow. These are sort of really interesting ways to stay in touch. I think in some ways, what is most needed right now is a transfer of both knowledge. I think it's really useful to know, for example, if we find out that a certain charity based in the US is funding anti-trans hate, we should have folks in the US who can tell us, oh, who runs this charity? Who are they being funded by in the US? That kind of work that organizers do for sort of anti-LGBTQ plus rights movements in the US, I think it's useful for us to have access to some of that information because already there are people, people like Mara Jones and others who sort of investigative journalists and reporters who've traced the sort of sources of this funding through sort of queer and trans journalist networks. So having access to that would be really helpful. And I think secondly, I think we need more engagement of the queer South Asian diaspora in the US with queer folks in India. I think it's a very sort of superficial relationship right now. We consume the same media, we maybe watch the same movies, but I think, things like the New York Queer Indian Film Festival are very important sort of institutions to build, more sort of queer art, sort of making its way to galleries in the US, and the queer artists finding some sort of audience in the US is incredibly important. Queer sort of South Asian artists in the music scene collaborating across India and the US is incredibly important. I think those kinds of connections, which used to be there earlier, are kind of fading, those people-to-people connections. So I'm actually really wondering we can have, and this is a longer project, even within the UK, where we're trying to set up a residency now for one queer artist from India to go to the UK so that people in the UK can also meet queer Indian artists, right? Instead of just folks from the diaspora. So do we need residencies like that in the US for queer Indian artists who can then become the sort of actual human point of contact to learn about what's happening with queer rights in India, right? Because that way, I think you learn more from the lived experience of a person than, over correspondence or even with just one person explaining it. So I think more queer South Asian folks, someone like Alok, I've now met multiple times and they've been in Delhi, and that's been such a fruitful exchange, because Alok comes to Delhi and they perform a set that is arguably targeted for an American audience, but it acquires a Desi flavor by being in India. And in some ways, them being in India influences the set that they perform in New York City because they're drawing in inferences and sort of instances of their life in India, which are very important. I think someone like Cal Penn does that really well now. Cal's been traveling to India a fair bit, and I think that kind of exposure allows him to be more effective as a political communicator when he works on Zoran's campaign, because he's more in touch with what Indians across both sides are listening to, consuming, and interested in. So I think it's a very fruitful exchange, and I think it's only been seen from an economic lens, and it's like, oh, VC folks should go to India because India is where you should invest. I think actually American museums need to come to India and vice versa. I think American cultural institutions need to come to India and vice versa. I think American sort of authors need to meet Indian authors, and more sort of collaborative work needs to be undertaken. Incredible work is being produced on both sides. I think we need to find some links.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you both so much. And so as we close, and we mark Pride Month in of 2026, I want to ask a question about imagination. In a moment where so much political energy is devoted to defending existing gains, what gives you hope right now? Not just optimism, but hope that has survived contact with reality. And what is a future you think is still worth fighting for, even if it feels distant today? And I'll start with Janani.
Yeah, I mean, Pride Month is exciting because it's a whole lot of things. It's the memory of Pride is a riot, Pride is revolution, Pride's a party, Pride's a celebration, it's resilience, it's joy, and all of those things really come together in my mind this month. It's also my birthday month. I'm a Cancer. And so this is a time where, I'm thinking about, what's to come, what's all the joyous summer energy that we can really gather up and be outside and celebrate each other for. But I mean, honestly, this conversation's giving me hope and giving me notes that exactly of what you just said of the importance of going to India and connecting with leaders there is so critical. I think that the future that I envision and hope for is that we have more solidarity with queer leaders in the United States, be that politicians, artists, business owners, entrepreneurs, like whatever it is. I think that we can't we have to get like I think of a future where we don't put each other in boxes that, oh yeah, a lot of that Indians in India are conservative and Indians in America are the ones who believe in trans rights. It's like, no, this whole conversation's been showing that it's so much more nuanced than that, and we have to do a lot of work to overcome those boxes. But I think the intersections between folks here and in India is probably so important. And specifically with the intersections that Anish was talking about with queer Muslims and queer Dalits and the all of the like the organization and institutes that I've not had as much connection with and that I want to. It's kind of in the same way here. I'm like, as a queer artist and politician, I'm like, how can we work with Black, Latinx, and other AAPI groups and figure out that queer solidarity when, like Anish said, you often don't even feel like you fit into the AAPI bucket. How do we do that here, but also abroad? How can we learn from what's going on in India right now? And again, going back to the initial legal framework, we should learn about what all legally India has and continues to do to protect the rights of trans folks and how we can push back, even in an authoritarian regime that we're in under Trump right now. There's always ways to push back, and we should be learning lessons from countries like India in helping move that forward.
Absolutely. And Anish?
Difficult question. I think almost facetiously, I'm very glad that this Pride Month, there are fewer sort of invites to speak at Pride events than there used to be, especially on the corporate front. I think the corporate world has finally realized that Pride is no longer sort of politically sexy and that Donald Trump does not like queer people. So they don't need to like queer people either. So I think in some ways, I'm bemused at the fewer and fewer number of companies that change their logos during Pride Month that used to change their logos, right? So it gives you a perspective and a sobering reality check about the state of queer rights in the world today, even across borders, even across sort of whether or not they're progressing or regressing, right? But in those circumstances, I think that's when the most incredible imaginations emerge, right? It is under these threats in moments of precarity that the most beautiful, the most radical ideas take hold, because you lose your attachments to forms of privilege that are afforded to you by capital, because those start to disintegrate. You lose your attachments to existing structures of power, institutions, because they've not been able to grant you rights, and you reimagine the systems that you occupy and the worlds you want to inhabit, right? And I think historically, there has been an overflow of creative production at moments like these. And you're seeing that right now, right? Queer cultural production is rising again in the most extraordinary ways. Some of your most exciting contemporary artists are queer. Some of your most exciting musicians today are queer. Some of your most exciting sort of folks working in new media, whether that is sort of creating films or whether that is creating podcasts or sort of finding ways to sort of capture imaginations. I think queer folks are at the forefront of so many of these things. And I think that's a reassuring sign that shows us that maybe right now we don't know how to fight back and win. Maybe right now we're at a process where we're losing, at least in India. And I think I haven't worked on an election that we've won so far, which is a bit of a sordid track record to have for 10 years of working in politics. It really is quite demotivating because every time you see an election result, you're like, we lost again. Like, why am I still sort of fighting the good fight? But I think the fact that so many others are still fighting that good fight and haven't given up is proof that we will come up with a political imagination that reimagines a kinder, a more care-filled world. And I think that's the hope I have for the future and the future of imagination in particular.
Thank you so much. I want to end with a quick audience question. So where do you see the isomorphism of gay rights coming from the US, which often centers gay white men becoming problematic when newer queer cultures are being created in the Indian context that maybe feel severed from our local context? And yeah, I think that was a question for Anish primarily.
I'm going to say this very quickly. I think, again, this is where we have to be very careful, right? I think there is a presumption that queer people in India don't identify as LGBTQ+, and they only identify with sociocultural identities, right? This is patently untrue. There are trans folks in India who do not identify as Hijra, do not identify as Kinnar, do not identify as Aravani, do not identify as Jyoti. It is precisely these trans folks that the government now wants to criminalize. It is precisely these trans folks that the government does not want to recognize. So there is a strange way in which indigenous queer identities are more acceptable to Hindutva than sort of queer identities that they presume to be imported from the West, which they decry as against Indian culture and identity, right? But I identify as a gay man, right? I was socialized as much on Queer as Folk, being torrented from like a random LimeWire torrent and being watched when I was 14 or 13, as I have been on Queer Indian history, because that's what I had access to. Even today, most young queer Indians have more access to queer content in English than they do to queer content in their respective languages, right? Because access to queer content in Hindi is harder, especially access to printed sort of Hindi queer content. There is more stuff coming out online, on Netflix, on streaming websites, on YouTube. But the problem is that, you know, everyone still knows Schitt's Creek, and everyone is still watching what was that TV show, which Modern Family, you know, and these are as Indian as they are American in some ways for a certain socioeconomic class, of course, but that exists. And in many ways, the dominant queer cultural production that exists is often more sort of complicit in the erasure of caste minorities and religious minorities than actually queer content that comes from abroad. So sort of queer American content sometimes is more progressive than queer Indian content. And that's a contradiction we have to live with. And it produces queerness that looks very different. I think we have to understand today that queerness is transnational. This fever dream that white gay men have, that they can restrict queerness to themselves, falls the minute they see a black drag queen and want to be her fans, right? So I think these are ways in which queerness is unsustainable as a sort of restricted entity, even as a national entity. And so when queerness is being transnational, I think worrying about the rise of gay men or the sort of isomorphism of sort of gay men, gay white men culture as it sort of encounters different contexts is less important to me than the importance of creating solidarities between everyone who don't participate in that culture. I don't know if that answered the question.
Yeah, thank you so much. I just want to thank both of you for the time that you guys have spent with us today. This has been a really fruitful conversation and has been really wealthy. And I hope that both of you have learned as much from each other as we have all been able to learn from you. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Have a wonderful rest of Pride Month and a wonderful rest of your weekend.
Thank you,
Thank,
everyone.
thank you.
And thank you, Janani. When you come to Delhi, you have to come home. You might just stay,
Yeah,
come for dinner.
I would love that. I would love that.
Perfect. Trisha offers open for you as well.
Of
Both of you should
course.
come together.
Thank you so much.
I'll put my email. Well, I think we have each other's email
Yes.
already. So
Right.
we'll connect. Really
Right.
nice to meet you, Anish, and thank you, Trisha, for moderating and really this conversation.